Roland had been riding beside Chris for most of the morning, but now stopped and twisted in the saddle to address Brent Eagle. "Hey, I think I see a couple of bears. Way over there, 3 ridges over. Want to get your scope out and see what they're doing?" Brent fished the black metal tube out of his saddlebags and put it to his eye. After a few moments following Roland's directions, he found them. "Yep, I got 'em. They're eating on a black cow. I hope they don't get our scent." Chris turned his face to the wind. It was blowing right towards that spot. "We better keep going, then." They'd made good time coming out of Yellowstone. Very good time, actually. They'd crossed the last high pass just the night before and were now in the Absaroka Mountains. Brandon, the archer, knew this area well, and he'd led them down, following ridges and creeks, crossing spring meadows and passing through pine and cedar trees. Chris checked the change-out mounts they'd brought along, as well as the 4 pack horses, and they were trotting with the riders, occasionally stopping to snatch a bite of grass, before hurrying to catch up. Over the last couple of days, their pace had been brutal, and everyone was feeling the effects. Rusty no longer ranged far ahead, but contented himself with trotting alongside the riders, as did all the other dogs who'd accompanied their owners. Now they crossed through yet another cow pasture gate, and as they topped another ridge, they could hear the unmistakable sound of a herd of cattle on the move. Cows and calves mooed, calling for each other, and riders whooped occasionally as they guided their herd from one pasture to the next. Soon they saw a man trot up from below, heading directly for them. He trotted up and stopped, letting his big gray gelding catch his breath after the long climb. Without preamble, he said, "Is that gate up ahead open or closed?" Chris let Sour Patch step up. "Closed. We leave the gates as we found them." Brandon and Roland, as well as Ada, flanked him. Not because of worry, but more because they were curious. The other cowboy looked at their spare mounts and the pack horses. "You might want to keep your loose horses right along the fence line. We have about 20 with us as well. Gonna leave a few guys in one of the houses up here, to guard the cows from bears and wolves and such, and the stupid refugees from up along the interstate. We caught a couple of them. They killed a calf, took 20 pounds of meat, and left the rest lay." He shook his head in disgust. Then he noted the scars across Chris's cheeks and did a double take. Looking at the rest of their company, most of whom were Tarins as well, he turned his mount and, without another word, continued up the hill. Chris exchanged a glance with Roland, who shrugged, then helped the 4 kids move the loose horses to the fence. They picked up the pace, trotting fast down into the valley below as they built a line of riders to contain their animals. Andreas and Chiari jumped in to help without having to be told. Both the rock Tarins had been raised on ranches and were good help. The travelers had their animals well in check when they passed by the herd of cows being brought up from the valley. Chris waved Ada close. She was the only girl in the bunch without the Tarin scars. "Sis, run over there and see if you can't find out who these guys are, and let them know we're just passing through." With a wide grin, she reined her horse around and trotted to the other cowboys bringing up the drag. The rest of them continued to hustle their loose animals past those of the other ranch. Once they were out of sight over a slight ridge, they slowed to wait for her, and the extra mounts and pack horses eagerly dropped their heads to begin snatching the green spring grass. After a few moments, though, they could hear the distinct sounds of a fight. Alarmed cries, men calling to each other as they coordinated their movements, and the changed sound of the mama cows, belligerent noises rather than searching calls. Chris and Roland stopped their horses at the same time and spurred them up the hill. Chiari and Andreas did as well, running to come to Ada's help, but she soon emerged over the rise, her horse running hard. Chris! The bears! They're attacking!" Her bow was in her hand, and she nocked an arrow, turned in the saddle, and let it fly back the way she'd come. Chris passed Ada on a run, his Tarin high and his hands loaded with flames. Taking in the scene, he winced as one of the cowboys was pulled from his mount, and both bears, large grizzlies by their golden-tipped coat, fell on him. The huge predators ignored the cattle and the riders' gelding, but concentrated on the human, and his cries rang out sharp and full of pain and panic. Arrows whistled across the meadow as the other cowboys tried to come to their companion's aid. Chris looked to his side and saw Floyd, the air Tarin, running hard beside him. "We can pull those bears off if we give them Tarins to chase, Floyd. Give us some kind of protection from those arrows." Then, racing his mount, he waved at Roland to stay back with Ada and continued up the incline. He released his fireballs, and both bears lifted their heads. They tested the air with twitching noses as the telltale resonance of Tarin filled the mountainside. The cows bunched together, bawling aggressively, then rushed away, along the hillside and down into the valley. 3 cowdogs coming from the other cowboys engaged the bears, snarling and biting. Without even breaking stride, one great boar swatted to a side. Rusty ran past Chris and fell on the closest, jumping up and getting a hold of the sensitive nose. With a violent shake, the predator dislodged the big dog, but turned away from the fallen rider. Brent's skinny pit bull, usually completely useless, sank his teeth into the thick shoulder and hung on. The bear wrenched and coiled himself around as he tried to dislodge the skinny brindle, while the other cowboys' dogs harried both. With Rusty and the pit bull's help, they managed to move both predators away from the prone cowboy. The bears paused their attack to deal with the dogs, but then the resonance of the Tarin filled the mountain meadow. As if following a signal, they lifted their eyes to the approaching riders and rushed forward. As Chris loosed his streams of flames, the fiery blasts were joined by 2 more. With a quick glance, he saw both Brent and Karsten loosing their own flames. Tarin-filled dirt erupted from the grassy meadow, luring the fierce predators to lunge towards the approaching riders. Over the noise of the bawling cattle and the flames and dirt flying, Chris heard both Roland and Brandon shouting at the cowboys, "Stay back! Don't shoot! Let our guys handle them!" Confused, the other cowboys slowed their horses, but kept their weapons ready as they watched the flames flying through the air and the mountain meadow erupt in dirt geysers. Chris could not help the grin that twisted his face into a grimace. The elation he felt from all that Tarin being wielded was almost overwhelming. Kiara rode up beside Chris and Brent and called, "Let him come! We got him now!" Addressing Andreas, she yelled, "I got the big one!" Holding his hands out before him, his horse being guided by leg commands alone, the Nevada kid responded, "Little one!" The ground erupted in a shower of dirt and rocks, completely obscuring the bears from sight. Chris had seen a rock Tarin at work before, and again it was so strange to see all that earth exploding without the whoomp of incendiaries that they were all used to from the movies and games. The only sound that could be heard was that of the rocks and pebbles whistling through the air and eventually striking as they landed. Then there was the sound of the trapped beasts, snarling and roaring as they fought their unnatural prison. Sour Patch, who was accustomed to running straight into Chris's flames, now planted his feet and refused to take another step forward. But there was nothing to fear. The bears were truly caught, and Kiara and Andreas, their hand motions reflecting the movement of the Tarin, continued to load more dirt on them. Rusty, followed by the pit bull, came from somewhere and landed on one of the bears. Brent's bony dog latched onto its throat, while Rusty tore at his head, and Andreas and Colby's Aussies buried their fangs in the other one. Guiding his horse closer, cautiously, JR came up. "Call your dogs back, so I can kill those sons of bitches." Lisa, the other water Tarin, joined him and dismounted. She handed her reins to Ada to hold, then followed JR boldly as Chris called Rusty. Brent's calls to his dog rang out, but as usual, they had no effect. While Andreas' pup left off and returned to his owner, the pit bull only buried his fangs deeper as the bear tossed his head back and forth, trying to break free. JR walked towards the bears, his hands extended. "Damn it, Brent! Get that dog back!" Brent moved his mount closer to reply, "And how do you suggest I do that? Go right up there and pry his jaws off that boar's throat? Yeah, no, I don't think so. But if you want to give it a try, be my guest." With an annoyed snort, JR spoke softly to Lisa, and they both moved to the other side of the bears. Keeping cautious eyes on the snarling, roaring killers, who were truly caught, stuck in the earth and unable to do more than violently toss their heads. The pit bull hung on, his growling muffled by the thick fur in his jaws as the bear tossed him around. Roland chuckled. "Dang, that dog has heart now." Chris looked around for Jade. The spirit Tarin might be able to convince the dog to turn loose, but she was not with them. She'd probably gone on with Brandon and the boys to make sure their loose horses didn't run off. He should just ride up there and use one of his laser streams to kill the beasts. But JR and Lisa had called dibs on it. He couldn't blame them. All the resonance in the area was enticing, and the two wilder Tarins had not been able to use their talent yet. With a simple hand motion, Lisa took all the water out of the first bear's brain, and as it lay dying, JR moved closer to the other one, the one with a skinny pit bull attached to his throat. Getting as close as he dared, he narrowed his Tarin, then closed his hand. The bear slumped down, his heavy head falling on top of the dog, whose growls rose to a louder pitch. Watching the pit bull snarl and worry at the dead bear's throat, the travelers began to laugh. It was a little comical. The wiry dog continued to pursue his kill, not aware that his opponent had died. It was right about that time then that Brandon rode up. Looking at the bears half buried in the dirt, and the little dog scrambling and growling under the neck of the bigger one, he exclaimed, "What the hell?" Then he urged his horse closer and said, "You got him, killer. He's dead. You can let go now." When the dog suddenly came out from under the bear, the rest of them laughed again, chagrin tinging their mirth. Nobody had even thought of simply telling the dog he'd won. Chris, however, thought that poor cowboy had been mauled so badly. He rode up to JR and said, "Why don't you take Ada up there and see if you can help that poor bastard who got mauled?" With a quick nod, JR waved at Ada to accompany him. Roland looked up sharply when he saw her leave, then guided his horse after her. Chris sighed. He'd forgotten about that. Turning all about, he looked for the spirit Tarin. Her help would be invaluable now, but he didn't see her. "Brandon, where is Jade right now?" Brandon indicated a place down in the valley. "There's a Brandon trap down there. We got all the horses in it. Everyone is waiting for you guys down there." Chris shook his head. Too far away. He spurred Sour Patch into a run and caught up to Roland, Ada, and JR. "Let's let Ada do the talking." He fixed Roland with a stern look, and his friend said, "What?" "Let's keep the chip on your shoulder under the coat, okay? If there's anything JR can do for that poor sumbitch, we don't need expert commentary." The other cowboys were gathered around their fallen friend. Two of them pressed their own shirts against gaping wounds, as another one frantically rushed to put gauze and bandaging around a leg. As the Tarins approached, though, the other men, the ones standing around and watching, stepped towards them. Arrows were knocked to bows as one of the cowboys called out, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! No further!" Ada cautiously moved her horse closer and gestured at JR. "My buddy here can help with the bleeding. Please, for your friend, let us approach." The cowboys murmured amongst themselves, then lowered their weapons and waved them on. JR didn't have to wait for a special invitation. Even as he guided his horse forward, he extended his hands, and his Tarin once more sang across the meadow. When Roland tried to follow Ada, Chris laid a hand on his shoulder. "Just let her do her job, bro. A few smiles from that pretty face and they'll all back off. Then JR can do his thing." Rusty nosed in, following Ada, but Chris called him back sharply. The border collie's great size would only alarm the other men. Kneeling beside the unconscious man, JR gave a frustrated grunt, dividing his Tarin into two directions. The leg already swathed in bandages, and a deep gash in the cowboy's chest. "Where is Lisa?" Roland, still mounted and watching, called back, "She's riding back down to take care of the horses." "Damn it!" JR looked up, then indicated Chris. "Get your ass over here!" When Chris scrambled off his horse and fell to his knees beside the injured man, JR said, "Burn the end of that artery. I'll get hold of the bleeding lungs." Chris stammered, What artery? Where am I burning?" Under JR's direction, he moved his hands to the right spot, but he shook his head. "What am I looking for, dude? I can't feel the blood like you. JR still directed fine, minuscule strains of Tarin into the cowboy's chest and arm. Heat. Feel for the heat of the heart's blood. I stopped it for a moment right under your finger, but it wants to gush past. That artery's cut, and you gotta burn the end of it. Putting his hands on the blood-soaked bandage, Chris felt for it and soon found the channel. As JR had said, the artery under the bandages was severed, and the hot heart blood continued to gush out into the wrappings. Concentrating his Tarin to the smallest, most delicate point he could build, he burnt the end until he felt the pulsing blood stop. He sat back and caught JR's eyes. They were lit up with blue, their light glowing under the brim of his black cowboy hat. He knew his eyes looked the same, and with a force of will, pushed the elation away as he pressed his Tarin back down into his core. JR saw, but grimaced. Not done here, he murmured, but thankfully closed his eyes as he continued to stem the blood flow. Even so, his eyelids continued to let some of the blue glimmer through. It was already too late, though. The men from the ranch murmured amongst themselves as they saw the glowing eyes and ridged and raised scars. It was only when the man who'd done the hasty bandaging returned, carrying more rolls of vet wrap and packages of gauze, that the other cowboys subsided. He knelt beside JR and asked, Where do you need these wraps? JR sat back, breathing heavily, but smiled as his glowing eyes abated. I think you got it now. There are some lacerations across his back. I stopped that bleeding too. Be careful when you move him. Those blood clots will have to set for a few hours. The cow boss rode his horse closer. Who are you guys? He was the one who'd met them just past the gate. An older man, his saddle and bridle well kept, while his heavy denim shirt was frayed around the cuffs and his boots were worn. As JR rose to his feet, took up a handful of dirt and scrubbed the blood from his hands, Chris answered. We are Tarins from the Yellowstone Circle. Tarins? The cow boss asked. What are Tarins? One of his men rode closer to whisper something, and a range of emotions flitted across his face. Finally, he gave a short nod. You are after the ones they got in our jail right now, I'm guessing. Chris stayed quiet, not confirming or denying the man's assumption. Yet, as it always does, the silence confirmed it. The cow boss shrugged his shoulders, his gaze not missing anything. Tomorrow's Sunday, and they put the word out that they'll have a big shindig in town. They'll even feed everybody. I'd ask you to stay and help our EMT here, but I imagine you want to get there well before that. With that, he dismounted and talked to the EMT. Chris looked at JR. They'd clearly been dismissed. With a gesture at Ada and Roland, he mounted Sour Patch and looked for Rusty. He found him down the slope along with all the other dogs. The rock Tarins had unearthed the bears again. They'd gutted them, and now all the dogs that had traveled with them feasted on chunks of heart, liver, kidney, and lungs. Brandon cut a large piece from one of the hindquarters and wrapped it inside one of his undershirts before stashing it inside his saddlebags. Finding the corral where the spare mounts were held, they met up with the rest of their group. When Chris told them they would have to get moving immediately, the four boys groaned loudly. Not quite teenagers yet, and not used to hard riding, the hurried trip was taking a toll on them. Brandon once more took the lead, and he confidently led them down through the Shoshone forest. He followed ranch tracks and sometimes cow trails, finding the gates to the fences, following streams, and easily crossing ridges. Eventually, they left the beautiful springtime greens of the high meadows and crossed over another large ridge. On the other side, the grass became sparser and the sagebrush more abundant. They passed another herd of black cattle, and the mamas bawled their babies to their sides, then hurried over a ridge and out of view. They found a gate in the highway fence and followed the blacktop for a while. The road was fenced on both sides. Back in the before, this had allowed cars to travel without worrying about encountering cattle. Now, it made Chris's hackles stand up, though. With their movement confined like this, their group would be easy prey for a pack of wolves who could simply slink through the fences, while their horses could not. He breathed a sigh of relief when Brandon took them to the gate beside a cattle guard and opened it. Whoever lived here used a wagon often enough to make a well-defined track through this gate. It led them up another cottonwood-lined stream, then up into another draw. There, they saw a log cabin situated beside a small pond, and just past them, under more green trees, a barn and several corrals. Several dogs, blue heelers and border collies, came out from the cabin to challenge their arrival. Chris immediately called Rusty back, telling him to stay close. The pit bull followed, and Brandon spoke softly to Brent. "You might want to get a rope around Killer's neck. You don't want him acting like an idiot on this man's place." He swept his gaze at every one of their party who had a dog, then turned his attention back to the cabin. "Hello, the house!" A man emerged from the front door, a crossbow carried across his elbow, drawn and ready. By the almost white scruffy beard and the lines around his eyes, he looked to be in his 60s. Yet his movements were fluid and purposeful. "What do you want?" Brandon stepped his horse forward a few strides. "Howdy, Bud. Can we come up?" Bud stepped forward and shaded his eyes. "Brandon? Brandon Norblood? Hell, they said you were dead. Yeah, come on up. But just you for now. I don't need that passel of boys with you clogging up the place." Brandon smiled to himself and murmured, "Grouchy old coot." Reaching back to pat his saddlebags, he called, "You're going to like what we brought you, Bud." He rode up to the cabin and, without dismounting, fished the heavy slab of bear meat out. As the two older men talked at the front porch, Chris and the others sat impatiently aboard their tired horses. They needed feed and rest if they were going to keep going. Brent came up beside him. "You had us running across all those mountains going 9-0 just so we can get to your sweetheart in that jail. Why are we just sitting here while those two old farts visit about their good old days? Let's get what we came here for and go." Chris moved out of the way as the pit bull barked at Bud's dogs. He lunged against the cord, and Brent pulled it back sharply, then yelled at him to shut up. The other Tarin had to circle his horse to keep the line clear, but at least the dog was tied up. Before Chris could reply, though, Brandon turned back and waved for them to come forward. As they rode closer, the archer said to Bud, "We saw those bears 2 ridges over and never thought they'd bother us. And then we met up with a bunch of cowboys moving their cattle to higher ground." Bud, still holding his crossbow, took the meat in his bloody wrapping and put it down by his feet. Then he turned his gaze back on the travelers who'd come into his place. "Yeah, a lot of the ranchers are taking them higher already. They're getting them away from the highway, away from the refugees and raiders." He stepped closer to the edge of the porch. "Did you see whose cattle they were?" Brandon shook his head. "I saw a 2L brand, but I didn't recognize any of the other riders. We met them just above the branding trap on Deer Creek." He gave Bud space to reply, but the old man only nodded, waiting for the rest of the tale. "Well, somehow the bears got our scent, though, and they came over a ridge running 9-0. They tangled up with the other riders first, swiped one guy right off his horse." As Brandon continued his tale, Chris called Rusty back. Again. Apparently, the 3 dogs belonging to the place were all female, and his companion made every effort to get the coy girls to flirt. Just as Rusty reluctantly obeyed, Brandon had gotten to the next part of their story. "Yeah, you see that boy on the gray horse? And the other one is that little chick on the sorrel mare. They did some kind of voodoo thing with their hands, and bam! Both bears were halfway buried in the meadow." The old man stood and gaped at Andreas and Chiari, the Earth Tarins, but Brandon continued. "And you see that little bitty chick with the blue ball cap? Her and her buddy, that big Indian with the black hat, they did something else, and the bears just died right where they were." Lisa and JR, water Tarins both, looked at each other, then bumped fists, grinning as Bud's open-mouthed amazement centered on them. Brandon gestured at the meat lying at Bud's feet. "So, Chiari and Andreas dug them out for us. Took them all of 10 seconds. We gutted them and cut out these 2 hindquarters for you. 'cause I knew you'd want 'em. The rest of the carcasses are still up there, right beside that thick willow stand on the creek." Bud took a deep breath, then leaned closer to inspect Brandon.
"You don't have those marks, but the rest of 'em do."
Brandon smiled. "No, Bud, I can't do any of that stuff. I'm just a hunter, just like I always been." Bud stepped back, clearly evaluating what he saw.
"Down in Cody, they tell us that you guys are devil worshippers, that you are all evil."
He came off the porch, his cowboy boots making thumping sounds on the weathered wood.
"Is that true?"
Some idiotic pulse made Chris want to turn to Andreas and ask him if he was evil, but luckily he managed, just, to keep his mouth shut. Roland rode forward then, taking his cowboy hat off. "Sir, I swear, that big sumbitch on the tall bay is my friend. Our family's places were next to each other, south of the Meeteetse, and we grew up together. He's still the same as he always was, except for that little extra thing he can do now, since that storm last Christmas." At Roland's gesture, Chris took his hat off as well, allowing Bud to get a good look at his eyes and the scars. Bud nodded wryly.
"Yep, that was a strange one. Lots of things changed since then."
Then he turned to JR.
"You're another one. Are you going to kill me in my sleep?"
JR took his hat off as well, but replied,
"Nope, but I might heat your shower water for you."
Bud's eyes lit up.
"Oh, yeah, a hot shower. I'd definitely go for that."
Filing amongst the horses in his yard, he came to Ada.
"And what about you, girl? Are you a devil worshipper?"
Ada smiled at him as she took her white cowboy hat off. "No, sir, I can't do any of that stuff either. I'm just a born ranch girl from Grass Creek." Bud nodded sagely.
"Well, get your born butt off that horse and carry this meat inside."
As Ada dismounted, Roland did as well. "I'm normal and born too, sir. I'll help carry the meat." Chris grinned. There was no way Roland would allow Ada to enter that cabin without him, but he was a little bit relieved as well. Better safe than sorry. Brandon dismounted and handed his reins to Chris. "Bud, we have 30 pounds of potatoes we got from some Idaho farmers. We'd do a trade if you're willing." Bud's gaze ran hungrily over the pack horses.
"Oh, hell yeah!"
He struck a feminine pose, tossed imaginary long hair over his shoulder, and said,
"I'd be willing to trade my body for a spud. I ain't seen one in months."
Brandon laughed. "I think we'll pass on that. We need fresh horses instead. 19 head. It was Bud's turn to laugh now.
"Oh, only 19. You bet. I'll just pull those out of my butt."
And he spread his hands.
"Brandon, you know I only got 6. Hell, you sold me that little bumblebee mare to me last fall."
Brandon nodded. "Yes, I know. But I figured you might know some others that aren't being used." Bud looked down the driveway.
"You're talking about Susan's horses."
He shook his head.
"Did you know she died last winter? Froze right to death inside her own house."
Brandon bowed his head and gestured a cross over his chest. "I'm sorry to hear that. I knew you two were close." With a nod, Bud accepted the condolences, then turned a wicked grin on Brandon.
"Good luck as to how broke they are. She liked to bury them. Always said she was saving them from some kind of calamity. She just didn't like to ride them a lot."
Brandon smiled at that. "Well, if they keep our feet off the ground, we'll be glad to have 'em. Most of these kids are pretty handy." As they sat and waited for the negotiations to be done, Brent huffed impatiently.
"Just how long are those 2 old farts going to talk? We've been sitting here forever."
Chris ground his teeth. That kid had no clue. They just gained fresh horses for everyone, and Brent's main concern was about how long it took. Could he not feel how their own mounts were struggling? Yet the stocky fire Tarin wasn't done.
"And now we're trading 2 bears and a sack of potatoes for horses that nobody can ride? Brilliant."
Bud stepped off the porch, his crossbow still held in the crook of his elbow.
Not happy with our trade, boy? Okay, you can just keep on riding that tired nag under you. Hell, he looks like a gutted sparrow if you ask me.
When Brent started to reply, Bud held up a hand.
Don't open your mouth and make it worse now, boy. Matter of fact, this trade ain't done yet. I don't see no bear carcasses lying on my back porch. If you want one of my fresh horses, you will help me bring them back here.
Without another word, he turned on his heel and stalked to the corrals on the back side of the pond. A bit stunned, Chris sat Sour Patch, his mind racing. He couldn't imagine a worse scenario. Brent, alone, with that old man? There was no way this would end well. Yet they'd all just tried to assure Bud that they, the Tarins, were good, normal kids. Not devil worshippers or something like that. It's just that Brent was volatile, not ever reliable, and the old man was not one to take any crap. Worriedly, he looked around his Tarins. Damien and Karsten, the other two fire Tarins, were part of Brent's posse. They would be no help for Bud. Floyd and Brady, the air Tarins, were of almost equal strength as Brent, but he didn't know if they could work their air blocks fast enough to defend against Brent's fire. In the end, he pointed at Lisa, the water Tarin. They'd all seen her take all the moisture from the bear's brain with just a flick of her hand. That might be enough of a threat to keep Brent in line. You go with him, okay? Thankfully, she understood immediately and nodded. Yeah, I'll watch out for the old man. In the meantime, Brandon indicated he knew where the other horses were. They left Lisa and Brent to wait for Bud to saddle. They also left the boys to watch the extra mounts, which grazed hungrily on the green grass beside the pond. Roland, hearing catching horses, came out of the house and asked Jade, the spirit Tarin, to take his cooking job over, and when Ada came after him, she asked Damien to take her place. The fire Tarin was only middling on the back of a horse. The ranch he'd grown up on had used four-wheelers for their cattle work. The horse pasture was less than half a mile away. Mares and geldings of all shapes, breeds, and colors. There was even a 2-year-old stud colt, gangly, but with a fair conformation. He lifted his head from his grazing and rushed towards the fence, mane and tail flying as he ran, neighing a challenge. While the young stallion reared and struck with his front feet, posturing to the newcomers, Chris sidled Sour Patch to open the green gate. Roland, always the first to wade into any job, began to push through the gate. But Chris said, bro, you might want to let Ada go first. I doubt you want your little pinky mare to have a baby next year. Andreas, the rock Tarin from some ranch in northern Nevada, pushed ahead. I got him. He grinned, and while both Roland and Chris shooed the little stud horse back, he pulled the end of his lariat down, then slipped through the gate. The stallion pranced back, then attacked Andreas gelding, his mouth wide open as he rushed forward to bite. He never made contact. The knot at the end of Andreas' lariat cracked loudly over the colt's nose, and the little buckskin diverted his lunge at the last second, then shook his head as he pranced round Andreas. But just as he decided on another try, Andreas' dog, a little shaggy Aussie, jumped in to bite the colt's hocks. Rusty emerged from somewhere and launched himself at the colt's nose, while Brady's blue heeler joined in and harried the colt as well. Still holding the gate, Chris hurriedly looked around for the pit bull. While the dogs had not sent the rest of the bunch running, yet the pit bull, stupid as he was, could really make this into a difficult job. Thankfully, Brent was tying him to a willow on the creek bottom. The rest of the horses, older and more experienced, had moved off, their ears swiveling this way and that as they watched warily. When the dogs sent the stud colt down the pasture, some wanted to run with him, but by then several riders had slipped through the gate and gained their positions. Roland shook out a loop, then pointed down the fence. Let's gather the rest and hold them in that fence corner. And Chris opened the gate to let everyone through. He called Rusty back, and the other two dogs returned with him. The stud colt came behind them, bugling and shaking his head. But the dogs had the same idea now. Whenever that buckskin got too close, they rushed out at him and sent him running the other way again. The riders worked quietly, efficiently, and Chris realized just how many of these Tarins had at least some working ranch knowledge. Only Brady, one of the air Tarins, really had no clue as to how this was supposed to work. He rode well enough, though, and followed instructions easily. The horses had settled somewhat in the fence corner, and Roland and Andreas moved forward at the same time, ready loops in their hands. They looked at each other. They knew this was a one-at-a-time job, and with a friendly gesture, Andreas allowed Roland to go in first. Roland grinned as he rode on, saying, "You already got enough attaboys when you and Kiara buried those bears for us." Andreas laughed, answering, "I'll let you have some sloppy seconds." Roland then slipped his loop on a gelding with white saddle marks over his withers, while the rest of the riders kept the herd milling in the corner. Bringing the old gelding to Brady, he showed him how to exchange rope for rope. With Roland's help, the would-be diesel mechanic changed his saddle from horse to horse. The kid would need a good old broke bugger like that, while Roland could take his chances with another one. While the others held the herd in the corner, Chris, Roland, Ada, and Andreas caught horse after horse and brought them out. So far, they'd all been rideable, if not exactly well-trained. As they turned their own mounts loose and sent them up the pasture, the little stud became a problem. He tried to exert his dominance over the newcomers. It was a little bit comical to watch the older geldings bat him away easily, then find their spots to roll and begin eating the good spring grass. However, the riders would soon have to turn a mare loose. Chris turned Sour Patch up the pasture, and the buckskin stud came running, trying to examine the newest arrival. While he reared up to challenge the leggy bay, Chris easily settled a loop over his neck. Taking his dallies, he turned Sour Patch away, but the stud followed him and tried to sink his teeth into the bay gelding's rump. The loop settled halfway down the neck before Chris managed to pull the slack out. When it finally came tight, the little stud bolted in fright. Realizing the colt might not even be broke to lead, Chris kicked his mount into a run to stay with him. Working the rope, he brought it a bit higher, but the buckskin didn't respond any better. Every time the lasso came tight, he balked, then tried to run. Using the rope, Chris halted the runs, but kept up with him, staying to the side as best as he could. After a few minutes of stopping runs and working the balks, the buckskin got the idea. If he followed Sour Patch, the rope would not bother him. Then he had a clear shot at Sour Patch's hind end, though, and without hesitation, he lunged forward and planted a bite. Cursing under his breath, Chris kept his coils clear and used the end of his rein to keep the colt away. Sour Patch only swirled his ears in response and continued to lead the obnoxious youngster towards the orange gate. Ada met him there and opened it wide for him. As he maneuvered the colt through, she said, "What are you going to do with him?" Getting the buckskin moving again, he said, "He can spend the night in one of the corrals." She indicated the dwindling bunch in the fence corner. "We only got 4 more to catch. I bet we'll be done by the time you get up there with him." With a quick nod, Chris urged Sour Patch up Bud's driveway, and the colt balked. Instead of working with him, bringing him side to side, Chris kicked Sour Patch, and the big gelding pulled. It would have turned into a fight, but Rusty had come from the pasture and, with a timely bite at the colt's hocks, sent him forward. By the time they got up to the cabin, the colt had figured it out. Keeping the rope loose, he followed Sour Patch past the pond. When Chris reached the corrals, he was glad to see he could open one of the gates without dismounting. Slipping the latch on the green gate, Rusty helped him bring the colt through it. Now, with most of Bud's horses still there, the stud lost his composure again. He reared up and tried to pull free, but Chris, as well as Sour Patch, had been ready for that. He brought his dallies a little closer, and together they brought the youngster back down, then guided him into an empty pen just behind the barn. Telling Rusty to stay back, he worked the colt into a corner and managed to get his hand on the Honda. Holding onto it, he let the colt pull the loop around his neck loose. With Sour Patch moving swiftly, now allowing the stud to get away, it didn't take long until the buckskin shook the loop off his neck.
Chris gathered up his rope, pulling the loops into tidy coils again, and left the young stallion to prance around his new sleeping quarters. After he had saddled, he turned Sour Patch loose to join their extra mounts. Without hesitation, the lanky gelding found a spot to roll the sweat off his back, then began grazing along the little pond. Chris gave Rusty a pat, thanking him for his help, then dug through his saddlebags. Finding a little chunk of soft liver, he gave it to the big dog, who slurped it down in half a second, then looked to see if there would be more. "I wonder if you have taste buds in your stomach," Chris laughed. "Stop begging. You ain't getting nothing else." The sun began its descent over the snow-tipped crags of the Absaroka Mountains to the west, its golden light painting the eastern ridges in orange and red hues. Looking at them, Chris marveled that they had managed to cross those high cliffs and wild ridges. When they had been right in the middle of them, they hadn't seemed as formidable as they looked now. He looked at their extra mounts and the pack horses, eating contentedly as their tails swished at spring flies. He called Connor, and the kid came running out of the cabin, holding a plate of food in his hand. He told him to hurry and finish eating, then take the other horses down to the lady's pasture. With a, "Yes, Mr. Focus, sir," the kid retreated inside, and Chris heard him passing the instructions on. Brandon emerged from the cabin, carrying a plate as well. He stood on the porch while the others came up the drive. Roland rode on, leading a big paint mare with his lariat. Reaching from his new mount, he stole a bite of steak from Brandon's plate. "Dang, I was going to tell you to come try out your new horse, but maybe we'll swap. You keep playing Gordon Ramsay, and I'll make sure your nag is good to go." Andreas followed right after him, and also reached up to take a piece of steak. Popping it into his mouth, he rode on, nodding approvingly. The archer chuckled as, one by one, the others stopped to steal from his plate. "What the hell, people? You think I'm some kind of drive-through?" Ada took another morsel away and said, "Could I have an extra large order of fries, please?" She grinned back at him as she rode on up the corral. The four boys, Connor, Rory, Flynn, and Matthew, came out and jumped on their horses. They gathered up the loose ones and took them down the lane. While the others called their dogs close, Chris sent Rusty to help the boys. Tired as he was, the big dog would only do as much as he had to, and the boys might need his help. A little bit later, it was full dark, but still nice and mild. A soft wind rustled through the cottonwoods and elms beside the cabin, while early frogs croaked quietly from the side of the pond. Spring would soon turn into summer. Chris had eaten his bear steak and the fried taters, and a tired, loggy feeling was beginning to settle over him. Yet he continued to check down the lane. Old Bud, Brent, and Lisa had not yet returned. Chris rose, gave his scraps to Rusty, and took his plate to the kitchen where Jade tended to the dishes. Damien was beside her, managing the fire and heating the water. Karsten sat at the table, and when Chris entered the cabin, the three Tarins stilled their lively conversation. In the sudden quiet, they watched his movements between the brims of their cowboy or baseball hats. Chris inwardly grimaced. That would be all they needed now, for factions to appear along their trouble lines. He thanked Jade for doing the dishes as he put his plate beside her, then said, "I'm going to go look for Bud and the other two, to make sure they're all right." Karsten nodded but didn't reply, and when Chris stepped out onto the porch, he heard their conversation start up again. He sighed. He was tempted to stop and eavesdrop, but for the one thing his father had drilled into him and his two sisters. It didn't matter what people said. It mattered what they did. Belatedly, he realized he hadn't checked to see if Jade's eyes had been illuminated with their purple glimmer. If she'd been adding to the atmosphere of that room, he hadn't realized it. Although it was very hard to miss the point of a heavy silence like that. No spirit Tarin was needed to get that hint across. When he stepped off the porch, Rusty rose to follow him with a low groan. Chris ran a hand through the glossy coat. "I'd tell you to stay and sleep, but you ain't gonna listen anyways." The others were gathered by the corrals. They'd been trying out the new horses, adjusting bridles and saddles, and generally joking and teasing about how each rider handled their unfamiliar mounts.
They'd been working without any added lights. The days when you could park a pickup close and leave the lights on, or hang up an electric spotlight, were long gone. Yet the Milky Way up above was a wide band across the sky, so brightly lit with 1,000,000,000,000 stars that Chris didn't even need his firesight. He found Roland and Ada easily, sitting close together on a corral rail, their shoulders touching, and smiled. It was good to see the storm between them had settled. Hitching the heavy belt up to his hips, he looked around the group. "Where's Brandon?" J.R., the water Tarin, grinned broadly.
"He said he had a headache. He's taking a nap in Bud's bed."
Chris nodded in acknowledgement, then said, "I'm worried that those three haven't gotten back yet." Roland jumped off the rail. He took his halter from where he'd stowed his gear. "Might not be a bad idea to go check on them. Only a month ago, we took out most of a whole dang wolf pack. That was only about 50 miles to the south. I thought I heard about at least one more pack up around here somewhere, and that was before we even went to the Madison camp." They saddled quickly. Chris saw his new mount was a small, lean Palomino, who was, sure enough, a handful to handle. Andreas, the rock Tarin, and his cousin Colby decided to go with him, and Chris told the others to roll out their bedrolls and get some sleep. When they got to the highway, however, they saw the three riders riding towards them, leading 3 pack horses. They trotted to close the distance, and with relief, Chris said, "We were getting worried about you. Everything go okay?" Bud, skillfully guiding his sorrel closer, replied,
"Hell yeah! Now that those 2 grizzlies are gone, it'd be as safe as taking the kids on a little Sunday stroll. They have been the biggest threat up this way, and your rock wizards finally got rid of them."
He looked at Brent and smiled.
"And thanks to this guy here, we have those big bastards skinned and quartered and nothing flat."
Chris couldn't believe his eyes. Did Brent actually smile back at Bud? When they turned off the highway and up the creek, Roland said, "We were worried about wolf packs. They seem to be getting bigger and bigger nowadays." Shifting in the saddle, Bud replied,
"There is only one around here, and their territory is to the east and to the south. The farmers to the east keep telling us that they are whittling their numbers down, but the wolves don't seem to notice. Any time I hear stories about them, there are always 20 or more."
Chris nodded. That jived with the reports he'd gotten from the council. Mother's enemy, San Pet, had sent the fleet predators to surround the bigger cities. Billings, Casper, Bozeman, Pocatello. They'd even had reports from Salt Lake City. Without the protection and safety of their vehicles, people were easy pickings for the fleet predators. They'd even heard of children being taken while out in the street or playing in a city park. And even though hunters and trappers might be taking their numbers down, there are always more, coming from the really wild places, like Yellowstone or the other vast national forests in Idaho and Montana. When they returned to the cabin, Chris stopped by the porch and called for Jade and Damien. They came out the front door, Jade still wiping her hands on a dish towel. With a few curt words, Chris informed them that the other 3 were back and would need supper. Damien started to protest, but with a look at Brent, quieted. Jade's eyes lit up to a low glimmer, and she rubbed a hand across her scarred brow. Then she knuckled the small of her back and gave a tired nod. "We'll have it ready when you get done up at the corral." Chris thanked them, but silently wondered if it would have gone so easily if Brent had not been one of the 3. Then he caught Bud's scowl from the corner of his eyes and knew he hadn't been off the mark. They might have refused if Brent hadn't been one of the guys who still needed to eat. He badly wanted to beat some manners into those rude kids, but there really wasn't anything to object to. They had agreed to do their jobs. Just as he turned his yeller gelding away, he saw the smallest wink from Jade. She'd used her Tarin all right, but not on Chris. At the corrals, Bud had commandeered several Tarins to help him unload the pack horses and strip saddles. Rusty nosed about tiredly, but wagged his tail when he encountered a friendly pat. The other dogs followed him about, and Chris could see that his companion had begun building a pack. The pit bull, Killer especially. He still paid no attention to his owner, but took his direction from Rusty. When Chris stacked his saddle in the barn, he felt around his saddlebags for the rest of the liver, along with a good chunk of kidney. He let Rusty eat the latter, looking around cautiously, and fed the liver to Brent's skinny dog. He hoped no one had seen that. Amongst cowboys, he just didn't feed someone else's dog, except that he doubted that Brent had any food for Killer. When they'd gutted the bears, the other fire Tarin had scoffed and said that his dog was good at hunting for his own supper. To be sure, it was difficult now to save a bit of meat. He'd wrapped it in one of his shirts, and now the shirt was ruined, and his leather saddlebags had bloodstains across the bottom. Those convenient plastic bags that were still around were hoarded for the things humans needed. As he came out of the back room, he let his Tarin flow to his hand. With the little flame riding just above his palm, he found his way easily. Suddenly, Rusty jumped forward and put his paws up on the rails of a stall, looking over the top. He made those small chuffing sounds that indicated he liked what he was seeing, and wagged his tail. From the darkness beyond, Colby, Andreas' Normie cousin, said, "Hi, Rusty. Could you leave us alone, please?" Lisa, the cute water Tarin, laughed softly, then said, "And no, Chris, we don't need any light. Thanks for offering." Chris had a chuckle, and he let his flame die. "Suit yourself. I was just trying to be helpful." Out in front of the barn, Bud was telling everyone what he knew of the Cody defenses. The wall of the town was in the process of building, the checkpoints the riders would have to cross, and the security at the jail. He told them it would only take 1 more hour to ride into town, and on his advice, the travelers sought their bedrolls. They would get a few hours of sleep before heading on to their destination well after midnight. This was a story from the Wyoming Tarin Rising series, and we want to thank you sincerely for listening. Please, press that like button now, since that will help the vid and the story get recommended for others. Besides, nothing makes a person's day more than seeing those likes. This part was called Wyoming Tarin's Rising, On the Trail. It was narrated by Josh C. Williams and written by Ashakery Dart. It is copyrighted for February 13th, 2026, and we want to thank our editor, Victoria Stormson. Hopefully, we'll have another one ready for you soon, so be sure to subscribe and check for updates.